In times of COVID-19, many people have questions about their religious freedom rights versus government intervention. Some communities are grappling with concerns about the separation of church and state. And also, there are concerns about government intervention. This webinar is a dialogue for people like you and me who understand the difficult decisions or want to understand the difficult decisions that houses of worship face during stay-at-home mandates and what it means for religious freedom. We hope that today's conversation will provide greater insight on the different perspectives, as well as inspire all of us to ask more questions. With that, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Lotta Knott. Lotta is a Freedom Forum Fellow, and she was formerly the Assistant Director of Admissions at Georgetown University Law Center, where she implemented strategies to increase diversity and promote scholarship program for high-need students and integrate technology into the Law Center's recruitment efforts. Prior to that, Lotta was a litigator in New York City with several law firms. In addition to her commercial litigation practice, she maintained an active pro bono practice focused on asylum cases and developed a proficiency in legal issues around internet, data privacy, and cybersecurity. Lotta is also a graduate of the University of California, Davis, summa cum laude, and also Phi Beta Kappa, with a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations. She earned her law degree from Columbia Law School in 2010. At Columbia, she was the staff editor on the Human Rights Law Review and chair of the South Asian Law Students Association. She remains an active member of the New York Bar and the American Bar Association. So with that, I would like to introduce our moderator for the afternoon, Ms. Lotta Knott. Welcome, Lotta.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. As Sabrina said, I'm Lotta Knott, and I have the privilege of moderating today's webinar. Full disclosure, this is my first time moderating a totally virtual panel, so please bear with me if there's any awkward pauses or technical difficulties. I'm sure I'll be a pro at it in 18 months or so, but I think it goes without saying that we're all getting used to a lot of things right now. This is a very difficult time for everybody, and for a lot of people, times of crisis are when they turn to their faith for solace. So what's really unfortunate about the moment that we're living in right now is that this particular crisis makes that incredibly hard. And a lot of churches and synagogues and mosques and temples are closed right now, either of their own volition or because they've been ordered to by their state or local government. And so, naturally at this time, a lot of people have questions about whether these orders are legal, what churches and governments and individuals should be doing, how people can continue exercising their rights to religious freedom but still protect public health. And it's just such an important topic to discuss right now, given that Passover begins tomorrow and Easter is this weekend. And it's going to be an important topic throughout the pandemic. So luckily for us, we have a great panel of legal experts, religious and non-religious thought leaders to help us figure out these issues. Richard Foltin, who, Sabrina, was he able to join?
Yes, Richard's here.
Fantastic. Hi, Richard. Well, Richard Foltin is a senior scholar at the Religious Freedom Center, which you may know is the amazing organization that is hosting this webinar. Richard's also a member of the Governing Council of the American Bar Association's section of Civil Rights and Social Justice and co-chair of the section's Religious Freedom Committee. Until 2018, he was the Director of National Legislative Affairs at the American Jewish Committee. Our next panelist is Maggie Grrett, who's the Vice President for Public Policy for Americans United for Separation of Church and State, an organization that's dedicated to advancing separation of religion and government to ensure freedom of religion, including the right to believe or not believe for all. Maggie has been working on these issues for nearly 20 years and currently represents AU before Congress in the Trump administration and oversees AU's state legislative program. We also have on our panel Mandisa Thomas, who is the founder and president of Black Nonbelievers Incorporated, whose mission is to provide secular fellowship, promote atheist pride, nurture and support nonbelievers who are beginning to identify as such, and organize nonbelievers for charitable causes. Mandisa currently serves on the boards for American Atheists and the Reason Rally Coalition, and was previously on the board of the Foundation Beyond Belief and the Secular Coalition for America. And our final panelist is Charles Watson Jr., Director of Education for the BJC, an organization that works to ensure that every American has and always will have the right to follow his or her own spiritual beliefs. He's a seminary-trained religious liberty advocate and educator. He routinely speaks across the nation, but today he's agreed to speak to all of us in our living rooms, so thank you for being with us. And thank you all so much for taking part in this webinar. Thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us. And we invite you to type your most pressing question or concern about this topic into the chat bar. The panelists will answer those after the discussion's done, but you're free to type your questions into the chat bar at any time. And okay, I just admitted a whole bunch of people off the wait list. Like I said, this is sort of a learning process for me doing the virtual moderation thing. But looks like everybody's here. And first, I'd like to give each panelist a couple of minutes to make some introductory remarks, what they'd like people to know about religious freedom in this moment and beyond. Richard, can we start with you?
Sure, glad to. Thank you so much, Alexa, and thank you, the Freedom Forum and everyone else who's been involved in organizing this important program. I've been saying for a couple weeks now, the title for this program, of course, is "I Can't Do What." Oh, you mean I can't do what? And I think given the time of season for the Jewish community, it's really could more appropriately be called "You Mean I Can't Eat What?" Because we're about to enter into Passover with all of the special dietary restrictions that come with that. But it's really what's as you've already mentioned, Lotta, what's important about the timing of this program is it does fall in holy seasons of the three Abrahamic faiths, not only Judaism, Christianity, but also Islam, which 17 days, I think, will be entering the holy month of Ramadan. So for all of these faiths, we've all been faced with enormous challenges these last few weeks as to what that means and what the import of that is for our ability to congregate for worship and to do other things that are done traditionally as a community, weddings and funerals, and all of that is simply emphasized by the fact that we're in this holy season now, when that the gathering together as a community is in some ways even more important. I'm thinking of the fact that in Israel, the Holy Sepulchre Church is closed for maybe the second time in 1,000 years. And the Temple Mount or the Al Sharif, whatever it might be called, is also closed. Nobody's worshiping there. So the question is, how do we balance? That's really what this is all about today. Is how do we balance what we see as our religious obligations and our ability to worship and to gather and to do other things that are required of us by our faith, and at the same time give due regard to the safety of all of us, which is what these shutdowns are all about. So I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think what's really important is to think about this in terms of balance. And sometimes doing a balancing test, there's more weight on one side than the other, but at the end of the day, it's still got to be a balancing test in which due regard is given to both the public interest and safety and health, and also the need for us to continue to ability for us to continue to observe our faith and fashion in an appropriate fashion. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Richard. And by the way, I'd like to encourage everyone watching to use the speaker view just so you can see the presenter that's speaking at the moment. Next, Maggie, do you have some opening remarks for us?
Yeah, sure. First, thanks so much for having me on this webinar, and thanks to all of you who are joining us. And I just want to start by recognizing what an extraordinary and challenging time we find ourselves in right now. People are worried about their health and their family's health. They're trying to maintain their emotional well-being. There's an incredible financial instability, and that's particularly for those who have already lost their jobs. There's people in fear of losing their jobs. It's not an easy time for anybody. And it's times like this when many people seek comfort in their faith community, whether by going to services or gatherings, or just congregating with, the people that they know through their faith community. And houses of worship are struggling too. They are also being hit financially. They're having the same worries about their staff and their members and their families. And so it's a really hard time for everyone. But at the same time, our nation is built on fundamental principles of religious freedom. These principles protect people of faith and houses of worship as much as they protect the non-religious and secular institutions. And even in really hard times, we have to adhere to the Constitution and the principles of church-state separation. For me, I've been seeing two main issues that are continuously coming up. There's a lot of questions about them. They're making the press, and there are some really hard questions. One is about mass gatherings. And the question that I'm seeing is, can the government temporarily stop mass gatherings at houses of worship? At Americans United, we think that so long as the government isn't targeting houses of worship for specific worse treatment than others, then the government not only can, but must ban mass gatherings in the same way they ban secular gatherings. A second issue that we are spending a lot of time on is the idea of funding of churches. So churches are also being hit financially. Can the government forgive the loans of houses of worship? Government funding of houses of worship would be an extraordinary change from our common practice. And so if we take that step, what does that mean? How can we do it? Should we do it? Our position, which I'm sure we'll get into more and more nuanced, is that there are some circumstances where houses of worship may be able to get loan forgiveness, but there are important safeguards and limits that must be put in place. And so I look forward to discussing these issues and other issues and other questions that people have as we go forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Mandisa?
Yes, thank you very much, Lotta, and thank you very much to everyone who's on the call and to my fellow panelists, and especially to Sabrina, who invited me to partake in this conversation, especially representing the non-religious, particularly non-religious point of view. So there is a philosophical argument that can be made for, especially in this particular time, and how effective blind belief in particular is serving folks. Certainly we have to ask the question of whatever God you believe in, how is it that this is possible? But that isn't the core issue here. The core issue is religious freedom, and I would also even add privilege, because there is a huge amount of privilege that the religious and religious institutions have in this country, and they've had for years, which, okay, if people still believe, then that's fine if there are, but traditionally, we're talking about tradition here, but also making adjustments in said tradition for the sake of the general public. Having religious freedom does not give anyone the right to endanger the general public. And this is something that I know that many churches, many religious leaders may be struggling with right now, but when it comes to the safety of the general public and public health, there must be adjustments made. And as we consider also the health and well-being of our members and parishioners, I certainly take issue with the fact that there are certain religious organizations that are making it seem like they're being oppressed, especially during this time, as if it is something that we are being imprisoned for. And it's for, again, it is to make sure that we come out of this as healthy and as productive as possible, with as few deaths as possible. And as we are seeing the number of cases rise, as we are seeing the number of deaths rise, there are legalities and there are also procedures that we all need to take into consideration. It isn't just the religious organizations that are being hit, it is also secular organizations that are being hit. There are, like you said before, people's livelihoods and their incomes are being affected, and having religious freedom or privilege should not mean that people are being guilted into supporting organizations that already have an institutional foundation, and they should not feel as if that is a priority. The priority is the general health of everyone. So thank you.
Thank you, Mandisa. And Charles, any opening remarks from you?
Yes, I found myself in the position of being here, not as a lawyer, as a person of faith, but also somebody that's a religious liberty advocate of all and those that don't have a faith. And so I hope this time together here is a way for us to have some civil discourse, to be able to talk about these things, be able to bring every voice into it. For me, I think about it as former military. I think about it as being a chaplain at Children's Hospital. I think about it now as my role as director of education, understanding different religions and what they're going through at this time. But also I see it as somebody that comes from a small town that has 4 stoplights, and how that is different from being able to be in DC and having connections, whether that's small thing as having internet connection to do wireless or virtual things like this. And I'm not saying that to say those people should not adhere to the things that are help to safety of everybody. But I think the way we talk about it and the way we discuss it should also have compassion on both ends, to be able to say, hey, you know what, we understand you don't have this capability, but there's something at a higher risk at this point. So we also need to think through it. So hopefully today our conversation is able to be frank and put everything on the table and think about what it means for not only religious people, but people of no faith. I spent a lot of time at my organization, BJC, saying not that type of Baptist. All right, so Baptists have fought for religious freedom in this country since the beginning, and sometimes certain Baptists have forgot about that. We're going to be reminded of that today and make sure that everybody knows that there's no such thing as a second-class citizen, so there's no such thing as a second-class faith or no faith.
Thank you so much, Charles. And I think that we're going to have a very lively and compassionate civil dialogue today, so this should be good. We may be having a problem with people being able to type their questions into the chat bar. I would say that if you do have a question, you are unable to submit it via chat, if you could email it to me, lnott, L-N-O-T-T, @freedomforum.org, then I will definitely direct it to our panelists as soon as we have the opportunity. Sorry for the inconvenience, but we still really do want to hear what our audience members are curious about and what they'd like our panelists to go into in depth. Oh wait, somebody's able to get on the chat. That's good. Okay, this is exciting. Again, sorry for any technical difficulties, but one way or another, we're going to hear from you guys. So I kind of wanted to start us off with the title of the webinar, which is "You Mean I Can't What?" Which refers to the fact that many state and local governments have issued orders prohibiting large gatherings or shutting down all non-essential businesses, which includes churches, synagogues, other houses of worship. And you have religious leaders who have reacted with defiance. Kind of alluding to something that Mandisa mentioned, you have religious leaders who do feel that they are being persecuted. A pastor in Louisiana has continued to lead in-person services, saying that this church will never close, religious rights dear, and we are going to assemble no matter what someone says. And he did call this religious persecution, and he questioned why retailers were deemed essential, but the church was not. So first off, I'd like to actually just get
Are we missing a lot?
Lotta, we can't hear you.
While she's getting on,
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Richard.
I just want to jump in on how Lotta was framing the issue. I'm sure there are folks out there that are scofflaws or worse, that are acting to the detriment of public health by continuing to have large gatherings in their churches or synagogues or funerals and weddings. But the good news is that they're actually a small proportion of folks that are involved in the religious community. And if you look out at the messages that have come out from the leaders of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim worlds, and folks who are heads of denominations or movements. They are almost all directing that their churches, synagogues, mosques be closed, and that there not be large gatherings. So I know that locally our rabbi has said you shouldn't even have 10 people try to gather together in somebody's home, which you could certainly even do with social distancing. And he's saying that even that shouldn't be done because of the need to not have gatherings and not bring people together except for small groups that are nuclear families. So we need to talk about the folks that are acting to the detriment of the larger community by seeking still to have large gatherings. But we also have to understand that for the most part, most faith groups understand that the first priority has to be to preserve life. In the Jewish tradition, we call it pikuach nefesh, saving life comes first. And if that means you can't have the kinds of worship services that you normally have, if it means you can't take the Torah out to be read because reading from the Torah requires you to have 10 people congregated, then so be it. We're not going to have those kinds of services for a while. Better to be safe than sorry. There is an important question: is how do we understand legally and in terms of how society responds to religious folks that still are gathering in defiance of these rules and regulations and directives, but we need also to understand that they're by no means representative of what's going on in the religious community generally.
Richard, if I could follow you on that, and I think I want to follow you because I kind of want to set Mandisa up to talk here. You came from a Jewish tradition of saying what this time means. For me, I think about it in two ways. Theologically, I come from a Christian background, and I seem to remember in scripture where Jesus said, don't be like the hypocrites who like to pray in front of the audience, but they go into your quiet place in your closet and get things done. And so I kind of see a way of us saying, even if I can't go out there and do this, I'm still connected to the God that I believe in that way. Now, that's not me saying everybody should do certain things a certain way, and I know that's a certain tradition, but I think we can find places in our faith tradition, those that have faith tradition, where these times aren't as unprecedented. There were times where there was no temple where people couldn't do what they had to do. We've seen this in our history. And so one of the biggest things I think, Richard, you said the other day that really stuck with me was, and some of the things I've been thinking is, what can we do at this time? Yeah, you mean I can't do this? I can't do that? But you still can care for others. And one of the biggest things you can do to care for others is to say, you know what? The best thing I can do for my neighbor right now is stay away. And that is a powerful message that I don't think some of our church leaders are thinking about in that way. There's always a way to put out the love that you want to see in return. And I said I want to go before Mandisa when I said this because she knows me. I dibble and dabble. I have to have religious freedom. I can believe one thing one day, and the next day, if I got better information, then so some people may look at my faith and say differently, but I believe faith is a part of a system that we have a brain too. And so I look at it for us religious people, we also have to be careful that when these things are over with, people don't look back and say, these people were the bad actors. These people might have caused the epidemic to go further. We don't, as people of faith, I don't want to be a part of that side of history. So I think we need to balance our theological thinking with also with the reasoning that we have there. And so I wanted just to put that part out there, not as a legal, but as thinking about it as people of faith and bringing our theology in it too, and seeing if that helps us.
This is Mandisa. I'm glad you mentioned that, Charles, especially as for those of us who represent the atheist, the secular, non-religious community. There was a report about Pastor Jamal Bryant, who now leads a New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, and his attempt to basically sell COVID-19 tests for $150 a piece. That was postponed, thankfully, but this just goes to show that, even like Richard said, that there may be a smaller segment of the of religious leadership that are acting in bad faith, if you will. They certainly are getting the coverage. There are certainly a number of people that are being representative. And I think it is up to religious leaders in the religious community to check them on that. And just as you have beliefs and texts that are subject to interpretation, take the scriptures that encourage people to worship in private, because the same way you pray at church should be the same way you can pray at home, and be safe for everyone. But now at the forefront should be care and compassion. And care and compassion is not a religious concept, it is a human concept. And so to, like you said, to stay away, or to just perhaps check in via email, via phone call. This is the time now for our communities to check in, especially on our elderly members. You can remind them to remain safe, especially as this pandemic affects them in particular, as it affects those whose immune systems are more compromised, taking a bit more, being less selfish in this regard of, well, how are we going to get our money? Because certainly economics are a factor. And again, that's something that we all are considering. However, we must have our membership in our communities around long enough for us to continue to sustain and survive. And so whatever needs to be done to take from those religious texts to have people stay at home or stay in smaller groups as possible, be as safe as possible, then use that to justify.
If I can jump in, I can't really speak to this from the faith perspective. I'm Lutheran, but they've never given me any sort of authority to speak for them. But I kind of want to talk about it from the legal perspective of, what can the governors be doing? We hear, there's been some lawsuits in Houston and some, the pastor in Florida who's been arrested and then saying you can't arrest me. There's some issues in California where a pastor is still meeting and has sent a letter saying, the governor of California can enforce these mass gathering bans upon him. We have been looking at a lot of the executive orders. They're changing day by day. It's kind of hard to keep up, but we've been focusing mostly on the mass gathering provisions. There are 45 states at the moment that have bans on mass gatherings in some way. Most of them are like, you can't have 10 or more. Some are now 5 or more. There's some that are a little bit higher than that. Of those, there are only 7 states that have religious exemptions. And, it's not all Republican or Democratic states. With Wisconsin, Michigan has one that's Democratic governor. Arkansas, Kansas, Colorado, Connecticut. And some of the arguments have been that they don't have the authority to tell a church what to do because of the First Amendment or church-state separation. We think it's actually the opposite. We think in a circumstance like this, if you are treating all gatherings the same, secular, religious, at a house of worship, at a secular spot, you need to treat them all the same. And in fact, to give them a religious exemption would be violating the Constitution. If you say that a secular gathering is too dangerous, which I believe it is, what the CDC says that it is, that if you say that religious gatherings can meet, that is giving a preference to the religious gathering over the secular gathering. In addition, there is an Establishment Clause principle that says that you can't give a religious accommodation or a religious exemption if it's going to harm other people. And I think it is very difficult to argue that a mass gathering exemption for religious gatherings is not going to harm other people, when you know that it puts at risk not just the people who are attending, but the people who they then come in contact with, and then the people that those people come in contact with. So it's our position that granting a religious exemption when that could force other people to get sick in a pandemic violates the Constitution.
So thank you for that. And really that covers like a lot of the things that I wanted to talk about before I was booted off this Zoom call, which I'm going to say kind of hurts as the host of the Zoom call. But I think we've talked about like what the government can do and what individuals should do. And you brought up the idea that the 7 states that have exemptions for religious congregations, that might be unconstitutional. Can I get some other thoughts from other panelists on this? Do we?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Richard.
So let me say it's. I mean, there's of course 2 religion clauses. There's the canon establishment of religion, and then there's the protection of free exercise of religion. And it's always a question as to which one we're supposed to be applying. It seems to me, to the extent there are bans that include religious organizations, the way to think about those is in terms of, is there some violation of free exercise going on? And if that's how you're looking at it, there's different standards depending which state you're in and depending on how, you know, it's somewhat complicated. But suffice it to say that either a law that would encompass religious gatherings is analyzed as is there a reasonable basis to apply the law to them, or there's a more stringent, more protective standard which says, is there a compelling state interest that can't be met by more narrowly tailored means? I think whichever standard you apply, the state is certainly entitled to come in and say the danger to public health entitles us to tell houses of worship that they can't have mass gatherings any more than other kinds of groups can have mass gatherings because of that danger to public health. On the establishment side, I mean, it's an interesting analysis. I think a little bit more contentious, but I do think at the end of the day, there's a problem with granting, certainly as a policy matter, there's a huge problem with granting that exemption to houses of worship, that the same rationale that applies to banning mass gatherings in secular contexts applies in the context of houses of worship as well. Having said that, there's really, and actually thank Maggie for this insight from another conversation we had, you know, in addition to thinking about the bans on mass gatherings, there's also the question of whether or not houses of worship or other religious operations are some kind of essential business, in which case they ought to be given at least as much leeway as businesses. And there, to the extent you're going to say gun shops or places that sell wine and liquor, or, you know, you could go down a list, are considered to be essential businesses entitled to stay open. Another principle that free exercise analysis I mentioned is that you can't treat a religious activity less well than you treat a secular activity simply because it's religious. So in other words, if you're allowing other businesses to stay open, which have no more of an argument to be essential to, you know, the well-being of folks on a daily basis, it's very hard to make the argument that religious institutions shouldn't be able to open to some extent to make their services available. But that still doesn't do away with their obligation, even so, to comply with the bans on mass gatherings. So what I'm saying is we don't need to be shutting down houses of worship altogether, in the sense that you can have somebody present in the institution facilitating dispersal of goods. I mean, people need food, they need other things who are in need, possibly to coordinate remote services and maybe have somebody on the premises taking care of that. And they can do that in a fashion that allows for being socially distant and in other words, being in conformance with the rules and regulations that have been put in place, but they don't need to be shut down altogether, and they ought not to be if we're going to be allowing essential businesses to remain open. I think saying that they can't be open at all for those kinds of discrete activities would be problematic.
If I could jump in too, Richard, I'm glad you brought up both clauses. Again, I'm not a lawyer here, but I work with some smart ones, and I try to break it down for I try to break it down for those of us that are from the country towns. But I look at this in a way of we're in extraordinary times. Let's make sure we understand what we're talking about today isn't normal life in America. This is a part of a pandemic. This is a part of a health crisis. So we have to be careful. We paint with a broad brush during this time, but when this is over with, we want to make sure that we don't have that same brush painting out on either side of this to say, oh, this is what we should do all the time, or this is what we shouldn't do all of the time. With that being said, I mentioned my time as being a chaplain in the hospital. This is where we have to have the conversation of what is essential, because during my hospital time, the doctors were essential, of course, the social worker was essential, and the chaplain was essential, because it's about the total health of a person. Mm-hmm. And so we have to think about that when we talk about that. Again, that may be separate from mass gatherings, but we also have to think about the fact that we shouldn't throw it out there that this isn't essential to the whole of somebody. It may be essential to the whole of human beings and humanity. And so when we think about the conversations that we're having, talking about, oh, is this essential, or is this getting treated better than this? We have a system, and again, you lawyers can talk about it better than me, but the one good thing I've seen about our system is that we do have exemptions, and we do have exceptions, and we do have things that we say, you know what, we would do this, but we do give exemption for this, or we do. And the last thing I'll say in that, during my military career, all of us had to be clean shaved. But if you had a medical condition, you weren't clean shaved. And then also if you had a religious exemption, you didn't have to be clean shaved. So we've always tried to balance what is important to everybody in our society. And I think we should do that during this time now. And I wish that our church leaders, and I'm not picking on the church, I'm just talking as a person of faith, I wish that our church leaders wouldn't have to have a mandate on them. They should just be doing what is wise at the time, whether legal or not, what is wise for your faith community at the time.
I do think, Charles, that the majority have done the wise thing without the mandate, because mandates came late, at least in the South they did. They didn't come early. I do have a question for Maggie, referencing, have y'all discovered any court cases that speak to this issue? I mean, if we're going to claim it's constitutionally, it's constitutional to shut down churches, are there any court cases that would even speak to this particular piece that y'all have discovered?
So there are some cases dealing with vaccines. So when people have challenged, like, can you force me to get a vaccine to go to public schools? There are cases going back to 1905 in the Supreme Court that talk about how the government does have the power to do that. There's some state cases. There's a case, now I can't remember the name of it because I don't have it in front of me, but actually, you know what? I think I do have it in front of me. There's a case called Prince versus, anyway, there's a case. It's called Prince. It's from the US Supreme Court, and it does say that, oh, here it is. The right to practice religion freely does not include liberty to expose the community to ill health or death or communicable disease. So that is Prince versus Massachusetts. So that is saying that, they do have the power to enforce something against you, even if you say that it is your religious freedom to do so. And then, of course, we have, as Richard was sort of going through some of the court cases. There are cases that say, the U.S. Supreme Court case under Smith says that if the law is neutral and generally applicable, that you have to adhere to it. So if you're going under that case, under the U.S. Constitution, they can enforce these mass gathering bans on you. And then, we have some of the compelling interest tests cases where I think Richard's correct that it would also come out this way. And then the harm cases I was talking about, there's a line of cases called Calder and Cutter, and they say that you can't grant religious exemptions when they're going to harm others. And so we think that that's a really important limit to place on religious exemptions.
Thank you. Sabrina, by the way, the chat bar is not working. That's why I can't get into the chat bar.
Okay, thank you, David. We have received some other questions as well, Lada.
Okay, yeah, if I may interject, I'm sorry to get my point in on this last one. I would say to Richard, I may interject or disagree just a little bit about religious services, or even, being somewhat essential as opposed to, like liquor stores, that's sort of making a moral argument. And I think that it's a bit unfair in a way to kind of make that comparison, because in an establishment of business, you can absolutely regulate how many people could enter into a liquor store. And also that kind of goes back towards the blue laws in southern states, in which there were, there were religious ideals that went into certain times that alcohol could be served. So I think that, that's a whole other argument here that I think might be balancing the scales just a bit. But also, too, we have to take into consideration, and I'm speaking from a layperson's perspective, that there are a lot of people who may not necessarily they may not necessarily know all of the, whether it's the legal or medical jargon, which we hope that everyone has a certain level of understanding of. However, if there were people who actually complied with these mandates, then perhaps we would be seeing less cases, right, of the pandemic. So unfortunately, we have to take proactive measures when it comes to dealing with everyday people. And yes, I would agree that, sure, there may be certain positions that might be considered essential and that everyone should not be in the mass gathering at one time. However, when you have religious leaders violating this, and it's a matter of record, and also when you have people who take things simply on faith and think that they will just be protected, especially at this time, there are measures that need to be taken. And again, there are things that we can do to adjust, but unfortunately, there are measures that have to be put in place, and there is just no getting around that.
So kind of on this topic, I just got a question from Delisa Mikadu. How does a chaplain help in a person's health care? What tangible evidence is there? Does anybody want to take this one?
I think there is evidence that in terms of mental health of folks, whether it's being military or elsewhere, that this is part of the care of the whole person, and people do benefit. I don't think I don't know that it's scientifically, that we can say so much religion is equal to so much health care. But the fact is, we know people benefit from it. They, for somebody who's a believer and for whom this is part of how they see the world, and the counseling and the pastoral care that comes from having access to religious leaders does make a difference in their lives. So I think that's absolutely true. I just want to say one thing in response to what Mandisa was saying. I certainly am not saying that the churches should not be subject, houses of worship should not be subject to enforcement of the rules against mass gatherings. And I think one of the problems, as we saw from several mass gatherings in Brooklyn at funerals over the weekend, police have been reluctant to step in and enforce those rules, and that's a problem. But at the same time, I think it's absolutely appropriate to compare secular services to religious services. In fact, the whole point of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and the way it's been applied by the courts, is to say, even if, I take that back, the whole point of treating regulations as being generally applicable and still enforceable against religious communities is to say that if you single out religious communities and treat them differently, you don't treat them the same as secular services, then you're violating religious liberty. So in this case, to say, well, we're going to allow these religious, these non-religious services to be open, but not the churches in any way, I think is very much inconsistent with what the law has been and what we should be doing in terms of assuring fair treatment of our religious structures.
No, thank you for that. And I was wondering if we could explore an adjacent issue for a second, because one of the things that we've mentioned when we're talking about the legal framework here is that I think Richard said at one point that you don't need to shut these organizations down altogether. You can have people, say, streaming live services. So even if churches are closed, they're not completely closed. And we've seen religious communities cope with this new reality, finding new ways to get their congregations to gather and worship by streaming. I think there was a pastor who introduced drive-in movie sermons. But, and this goes off something Charles mentioned in his opening, I mean, is there a cost to this? Are there concerns about the fact that so much worship is now moved online because, of course, not everybody has internet access? Are there best practices here, long-term consequences? And Charles, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I can expand on that. It's funny, everything that we say here has balance to it. And if you, or two sides of a coin to it, if you will. Yeah, so I grew up in a small town where the only time we got together for my mom's church was on first Sunday and fourth Sunday. And my dad's church, the only time we got together was second Sunday. Now, this was born out of a tradition that back in the day, people could not get to certain places without cars, without those things. So they kept those traditions. And so you can just imagine if you still got that type of tradition, you're not going to have online streaming of services. And that's just it. But also with that, as I battle with that, and I can be fully honest with you guys, I actually eulogized one of my best friends maybe a week and a half ago down there. It was tough for me to make the decision to drive down. Of course, I didn't fly, but whether he was religious or not, his mom still wanted a burial service. So how do we go about that? Legally, in some places, it was still legal to have funerals. In other places, you could have funerals, but make sure you're outside. So we were outside, graveside, doing these funeral services. And I tell you, it's still tough in my mind because I'm like, we're practicing social distance, but this is still dangerous. But we also, to the question that was put in before, as a person that was acting as a chaplain at that time, you can't tell me that being able to actually bury my friend's son, my friend, wasn't helping the whole person, just as if a doctor was there trying to save her son. So I think we have to be careful and understand that we're talking about a time that's like none other. We should learn from this. We should do our best in this time, but we have to know that this is a time like none other. And I'll wrestle with that for the rest of my life, whether that was the right thing to do or was it not the right thing to do. When I looked in my friend's mom's eyes, I felt it was the right thing to do. As I drove back, I wrestled with that. So these are not easy decisions. Some are easier than others. I would agree with Mandisa on that. Some are just like, come on now, let's be for real. But it is tough. And where you live and what your religion is, the practice that you're doing, communion for certain people, Passover, how those rituals have been going on for years and how they actually work with each other. Some are able to go without hesitation and go without any hurt or harm. Some it is eliminated. So we have to understand that those are differences too.
Thank you for that. And I think that actually touches on the fact that, we talk a lot about like religious gatherings, services in churches and synagogues, but this also has a huge impact on rituals, like funerals, like other religious practices. Does anybody have any thoughts on that and how, if there are suggestions, is it always a balancing test of health versus safety, or are there ways that we can connect with each other without being in the same room?
Well, people
Yes.
are doing, and thank you for that, Charles. It's important, even as we're obligated not to minimize the experiences and lives of people that don't have religious faith. It's important also, on the other side, not to in any way minimize the importance of faith, people that hold those faiths. And yes, there's people are now participating in funerals by virtually and doing just what Charles has done. You'll have somebody officiating, and you'll have the nuclear family present at the graveside, and then others participate. A friend of mine, his father passed away in the last couple of weeks of the virus, and the Shiva visit was a virtual Shiva visit, as to say his 7 days of sitting and having friends visit was all done over Zoom, and we got to deliver words of comfort. And the rabbi said words of prayer, and it was very moving. It wasn't the same as being in the room with my friend, but it was something, and it had meaning to him and had meaning to us. So yes, a lot of people, those who aren't, there's differences within Jewish communities as to whether or not one is allowed to have a Zoom Seder, to have to speak in a Seder through computer. But for those that do allow that practice, there's going to be an awful lot of Zoom Seders taking place tomorrow night, globally. People participating in Seder gathered around the table, as it were, or around the laptop. So, folks are doing the best they can under very extreme circumstances.
Yes, there always needs to be a balance of safety and tradition and this idea of comfort, because that is what I'm hearing, that in people's time of either grief or need, that there is a comfort that certain leaders do provide. And with that being said, there is still a disproportionately low number of humanist chaplains in the public eye. So let's just get that out there. But also, too, we also need to take into consideration that there are a lot of people, millennials and younger people in particular, that are leaving or that are letting go of these traditional traditions. And as as these things change, as the way people do celebrations of life change, and this is, we're in the age of more information, more technology, and so now there are, again, adjustments that need to be made. And for some people, it may be harder. Those who are hardline on those traditions, this is a wake-up call. And again, it's understandable that it's a tough one, but it is important for us to understand it nonetheless, and not just understand it, but also implement and act on what is in the safety and best interest of everyone involved. And there's a way to do that. There is still a way to offer that care and comfort and concern while we are in this temporary circumstance that hopefully does not become any more permanent, because people feel like they are exempt due to whatever religious freedoms they have.
Thank you for that. And by the way, we have lots of questions and comments coming in, but I'm just going to ask one last question to our panel before I turn to those. We are seeing that in a lot of crises that have happened in the past, religious entities and communities have often served an important role. They've served charitable functions. But in this one, what are your thoughts about what role religious communities should play in the COVID-19 pandemic? And part of that is when we look at, say, issues about religious organizations being eligible for government aid, like the Federal CARES Act that provides emergency aid to individuals and businesses. I did want to think about, Maggie mentioned in her opening comments that there were certain safeguards that she thought should apply to those. I did want to talk about that, and any other thoughts that our panelists have about the charitable functions that religious organizations often serve during crises.
Well, I'll get that conversation started. I think that if there are religious organizations that do apply for this government aid that is being offered by the Small Business Administration, that they should have to pay that money back. The same way any other business would, because it's like you can't have it both ways. You can't want your religious exemption but then want government aid. It's like that's an extremely unfair imbalance there, and it's also a privilege and a preference, like we talked about earlier. That is giving preference to certain belief systems, and it's unfortunate that we're seeing this on the secular side every day. We're seeing the implementation of religion into public policy. There are organizations that are fighting that daily, and so to grant this outright privilege and the ability to help certain religious institutions that, once again, may already have a foundation in their membership support in certain grants and having donors that other organizations may not have access to. I'm not talking about the smaller churches who, like small organizations like ours, are still struggling to keep our lights on. That's completely understandable. However, when it comes to larger institutions who feel like, well, they're just losing money if they don't have services, they should not be allowed to partake in getting this aid. I think it should be on a case-by-case basis, and if the religious organization does not qualify, then they should be rejected, plain and simple.
I'm happy to jump in too. So as far as providing secular services, religious faith-based organizations can get money, as they have for a really long time, to provide secular services. So if they are in this time of crisis providing services, they can continue to get money to do those. Like, I'm trying to think of now examples of that, but sometimes they're doing like, they're renting out their parking lot, for example, to do drive-through testing. If that is a secular service, they could receive government funds for doing something like that. They could get government funds if they are taking on the job of delivering meals to kids who normally would get them at school, now aren't getting them. They're trying to find ways to provide these meals to kids. If there was a religious organization that they were performing that secular service, they can get reimbursed for those funds. Then it becomes a more difficult question when you're talking about loans and loan forgiveness. So there's a small business loan provision in the new CARES Act, and it allows nonprofits to get loans. Now, even allowing nonprofits to get loans is a big change. Normally, nonprofits are not prohibited or not allowed to do this. And so they've changed it to allow nonprofits with staff under 500 to get loans. Houses of worship are included in that. They can get loans. We have some concerns about that, but they are loans. They pay the money back. And so we are not, challenging that. We do have some concerns when it comes to loan forgiveness, which in our eyes is really just like giving a grant, right? So you get a loan and then you don't have to pay it back. That is just government funding. And if it's a house of worship, that is government funding going straight into a house of worship. Now, we have decades of tradition saying that the government doesn't fund religious activities. If you are thinking about that, this is a huge jump if we say that you can get loan forgiveness, so a grant to pay the payroll of your pastor or to pay for the person who is leading worship or something like that. So we have serious concerns, church-state concerns, about taking this step. Our nation has, the First Amendment, and one of the fundamental reasons that we have that was because they were concerned about taxpayers funding clergy salaries. And that has always been something that we just don't do. And this is not just for the protection of secular people and non-believers. It is for the protection of houses of worship, so there is not entanglement. That is for the religious freedom of believers who have different faiths. It is to ensure that there aren't certain religions that are getting a lot more money than the sort of small religions. And so there's lots of reasons why we have these protections. And so we think that the Small Business Administration would be making a big mistake to not put some of these protections in.
I actually got a question that sort of dovetails with this conversation. Phil Session, who runs a secular organization in Texas, which provides aid to those experiencing homelessness, he says that his organization is allowed to operate as an essential charitable business. However, in operation, we still observe social distancing, 10-person limits, and the use of PPE and donation prep and active distribution. That being said, shouldn't churches that wish to continue operation be required to observe the same or similar virus mitigation measures as public health should still be the focus?
Well, of course they should. That's what we're saying. The law is that even if you don't allow, even if you allow a church to remain open as an essential service, it's got to comply with all these other public health regulations. That there can be no leeway on that at all. I just want to respond to what Maggie was saying. I mean, under ordinary circumstances, I would agree with all of that. Certainly the issue of government funding going directly into the pockets of houses of worship for any purposes was a core establishment clause concern. It was a core concern of the framers when the First Amendment was adopted. There's no question about that. The question now is whether we're in a special circumstance where, and I think there's a set of issues which I call social insurance issues, which have to do with when we're dealing with responding to a natural disaster or responding to the plague, as it were, right now, or providing resources to houses of worship along with other nonprofits to get funding to enhance their infrastructure because of threats because of security threats. So I think for those special kinds of cases, I wouldn't be as strict about the forgiveness. I mean, as long as these houses of worship are being treated the same as everybody else, that is to say, if they're not getting loan forgiveness on any terms that are better than those that are being given to other nonprofits, I would say under these special circumstances, the idea of having these organizations having to then come up with the money to repay these funds when other organizations are not having to do so, and given the extremists that they're all in, I mean, it's not a, you know, it seems to me that this is a special kind of situation. I would view it through that lens, but as soon as we're back to normalcy, I want to emphasize, I would revert to the earlier analysis, which says that we need to be very troubled about money that flows into the coffers of houses of worship.
Well, actually, William Wildhack asks, does Trinity Lutheran change the landscape for loan forgiveness like it did for playground funding? Any thoughts on that?
Trinity Lutheran. Charles looks like he wants to say something.
Richard, I wanted to say something before Trinity Lutheran. I'm gonna leave Trinity Lutheran to you. I think we can circle all that back into Maggie and Richard with the Trinity Lutheran. But I did want to make the point, and we're not going to skip that question. It's interesting that Maggie has a perspective on it that, and I don't want to misrepresent you, Maggie, with this. It was a perspective that says, hey, shouldn't be giving. Richard has a perspective that says, in normal times, I would be against this, but during this time, maybe so. And I have a even different one of that, but it all ties together. For me, I want to think about it not in a legal way, but I want to caution people that have houses of worship, and I'm not talking about the people that are doing pantries and stuff like that, even though all of that is nonprofit. And I think that's an important thing to say. This is all under the nonprofit. Churches are not being treated different than any other nonprofit in this. This is all under the same spectrum. But with that being said, I think churches and houses of worship, I should say, should think about the fact that, hey, if I take this government money, I don't know what's coming after that. They have some regulations out there right now. Things can change. And so one of the things that protection of not getting government funding does, it makes sure that you are still able to step away from the government when you want to do the things that you need to do that don't fall up under the government guidelines. And that's a protection for the government, and that's a protection for the house of worship. So I'm not telling people not to do these things. I'm just telling you to be wise and think through it, because even in my going to school, I was in the military. I used my veterans assistance to pay for my grad school. There were grad schools that would not take my military money to pay for it. They say, nope, because we don't want anything coming from the government, because at some point in time, the government may say, hey, since you took this is now the rule here. So I want to put that practical thing out there of, hey, let's think through this too, because you just never know what this ties you back into. And then y'all can take Trinity Lutheran all you want.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at Trinity Lutheran. So Trinity Lutheran says that you cannot turn away someone because of their religious character, right? So they couldn't say religious groups aren't eligible for the SBA loans or for SBA loan forgiveness. But Trinity Lutheran also makes very clear that that it's about your religious character, not about the uses of the money, right? So you can get playground materials, which is playground materials, secular. But what we're talking about here is money that would be paying for the pastor, right, who is doing religious function. So that is sort of a distinction that we see, whether it's the character, so like who the organization is rather than what the organization is doing with the money. So that's why we see some nuance in, you know, if the funding is going to secular services, if the money is going towards, you know, utility bills or something like that, that might be different. If the money, maybe even, you know, these are hard questions, maybe even if it's going towards a function at the house of worship that is a solely secular function, you know, you're paying employees who are not engaged in any ministerial positions, maybe that is okay. But Trinity Lutheran's about character, not use.
And I agree with you about, I mean, I hope that's what Trinity Lutheran means, is what you've just said, Maggie. That is, we don't know actually what the limits are. And with what we've got now, I'm afraid to predict what those limits are going to be. But again, it's really a matter of where we are now versus how I would want that. Under other circumstances, where we're not dealing with what we're doing now, I would absolutely agree with you that those funds should go for those purposes. And we're really just deciding what does the current situation mean for us as opposed to what the rules should be in normal times. I also want to just say about Charles's comment, I think that's a very good point. Whether even the money's available, these religious organizations have to think very carefully about what they're getting themselves into. Some of us remember Dean Kelly, who was, one of the great church-state experts in the country. He worked for the National Council of Churches, and he had the great benefit of not being a lawyer, so he really understood this stuff. So Dean used to love to say, "With the king's shilling comes the king," and that's what anyone who receives government money has to think about, is what they're doing when they open that door. But, that's a principle of care as opposed to necessarily a constitutional factor.
Yeah, thank you. I think everyone's done a good job of kind of breaking down both the practical and legal applications of this. And there's a question from Anna Saniva, who wanted to actually get a little bit away from the conversation being about beliefs versus safety and talk about faith-based groups who are taking responsibility to provide non-denominational help right now, like ensuring that their congregations stay home, but providing volunteer help in the community, sharing supplies, encouraging their parishioners to donate blood to the Red Cross. Many of us do this work now, and it should be acknowledged. You can't talk about religion and disregard its socioeconomic role. That's interesting. I mean, given the role that religious communities often play in these types of crises, is there a sense that they should be encouraging their congregations to act in a certain way? Are they obligated to do that morally more than legally?
I think that if you are the leadership in a religious institution, yes, you absolutely should be encouraging your members or parishioners to do the absolute best they can for the interest of public safety and the general public. The concern that I have about religious institutions, particularly or potentially receiving funds for secular services, is that there is the potential that they are trying to impart their beliefs onto people receiving them. And so this is where we have a violation of church and state, as well as the imposition on one's beliefs in order to get that help. And so we have to take these things into consideration as well. And also, could these funds potentially be taken away from other government entities or public schools or other things that are offering the same or similar services? Can there perhaps be collaborations to that end? But yes, absolutely. If you aren't having church services, and also there's a way to help the general public while also being safe, because there are a lot of people whose mental well-being is at stake, even in leadership, because let's not forget about that. There are a lot of us who are expected to serve the public. However, our own well-being is at stake here. So just a communal base, a communal support system for both members and leadership is absolutely necessary. And I think the religious leaders, or even leaders or community leaders, should absolutely encourage their members to do something for the sake of the general public, in addition to their families, especially during this time.
And kind of speaking of the general public, what does everyone think about? Well, we do see certain groups, racial and ethnic and religious minorities, being scapegoated in this crisis. So what do you recommend when it comes to practicing sensitivity and compassion towards those groups that are targeted or blamed for the pandemic? Actually, I read recently that a religious leader who leads Bible studies at the White House wrote a blog post kind of putting the blame on the pandemic on the LGBTQ community and atheists. So, that's something that we do see coming up, and we'll probably see more and more as the pandemic goes on. What do you think of this rhetoric? What's our best practice to combating it?
And then folks, there's one pastor who's been widely quoted now talking about the Jews, blaming it on the Jews and saying they're being singled out for particular harm because they haven't accepted Jesus. There are folks blaming Chinese Americans. So there's no shortage of hate out there. And I think in these times especially, but it's always the case, that we need responsible voices, religious voices, secular voices, leadership voices in the government and out of the government to speak out and to be in solidarity and allyship with any community that has been victimized in this way, in all the ways that we do that, and to give no countenance to bigotry and hate that's being, and even worse, there were some cases of I don't know about other communities, but Asian Americans have been physically attacked because of this. There's somehow blamed for what's happening. So we just need to all be there and be counted, and see many organizations from different walks of life, speaking out very strongly and trying to educate the public. So we need to be very aware of this and respond strongly to it as now and at any time.
Yeah, I think we have to call a spade a spade. When somebody says something stupid, we need to say that's stupid. And it's okay to say that's stupid. I'm not saying the person is stupid. I'm saying that is stupid. The statement is stupid. And so we have to be able to say that. Many times when different attacks come across this country, people expect people from those so-called terrorist groups to speak out against things that are happening. So at this point, as a person that claims Christianity today, if somebody says something stupid like that, I want to say that's not all of us that are Christian. That is just a stupid statement on that. But I also want to tie it into government religious groups taking money, because you have to think, if they have that mindset about certain people, who do you think is going to get the money for all this funding? There's going to be discrimination in funding too. So we have to be careful and understand that that's the other part of these organizations. Are the minority religions actually going to be treated the same as the majority religion, or is this going to be money funneled into the majority religion and even further than that? So just be thoughtful, think about it, call a spade, and go from there.
I think if it's non-discriminatory, I mean, one of the points about disaster relief is that it's supposed to be non-discretionary funding. So
it's supposed to be, Richard. I agree with you.
And we've always got to be careful. The moral hazard that you identify of when there's discretionary funding, that's a huge problem when that money goes to religious organizations, to the extent it's referring to other religious communities. But yeah, we have to be careful about that. Just as I wanted to just pick up the point Mandisa was making on the social services side. So, as Maggie has said, it's like religious organizations doing social service, secular social service provision for, I think, over a century at this point. But we need to be careful that there are safeguards in place to assure when they get that money, they're not using it to proselytize, engage in religious education. In fact, there were guidelines, there were rules that were adopted during the Obama administration that had right-left support to assure that there were safeguards in place when religious organizations receive funds to provide secular social services. Unfortunately, maybe not surprisingly, the current administration has weakened some of those protections. But all these are good points, I think, in terms of care that has to be taken.
If I could, I'll make it quick, but just jump in on the question you had about some of the good work that faith groups are doing as far as mass gatherings or educating people. I just wanted to sort of emphasize how important I think it is that for some of the organizations that recognize the importance of not having mass gatherings, speaking out, educating their congregations, like the Union for Reformed Judaism has a website that helps with all sorts of information about how to, do your services on Zoom and all sorts of resources. There is the Auburn Seminary, who has created a campaign called the hashtag Faithful Distance. They are having people, clergy, take pledges saying that they recognize the importance of protecting life and not having mass gatherings, and sharing information about how you can both be truthful to your faith as well as saving the community around you. The National Association of Evangelicals joined with Christianity Today in a statement that they put out talking about how temporarily convening remotely doesn't deny your faith or cease worshiping God, how canceling in-person services isn't the same as canceling worship. And so I think all of these messages are really important for the person who is at home thinking, you know, I feel like I should go to church, but I'm afraid to go to church. Is it okay that I don't go to church? I think it is important to hear voices from your faith tradition telling you that it is not, you know, it is okay to stay home and why, the voices that you trust. So I think that all of those things, helping congregations as well as speaking out to the people in your congregations, is incredibly important to saving people's lives at this moment.
I think there's also something to be said about allyship here, right? You know, especially in this time, this day and age. It is important that whether you're religious or not, that you understand that there are people who have different perspectives, different points of view. There are people who believe in different gods than you. There are some people who don't believe. But as people, that most of us, again, can help each other and show compassion, and that morality is a human concept. And so when we are talking about, you know, discriminatory, and certainly as atheists, we've seen this in the public eye, we've seen this in the public realm, and so we're fighting against that. But also, it isn't just for our sake; it is for the sake of others to be able to practice in a way that is fair to everyone, but that we understand that we exist as human beings, and that we get further, you know, as we stand up for each other. And once we see these things happening, then we call it out. Like Charles said, you call a spade, and you do what you have to, as much as possible, to dispel those myths and misconceptions.
Thank you. One thing, just since we have about 10 minutes left, I just wanted to make sure that every panelist has some time to give some closing remarks. So my last question for all of you is, what are the long-term consequences that you see from this for religion, for religious freedom? What's at stake if we don't protect religious freedom? And, you know, as we've discussed over the course of this webinar, that can mean allowing the separation between church and state to disintegrate. It can mean discriminating against particular religious groups. But essentially, like, what do you think is at stake in the course of the pandemic? Can we start with Charles, because his picture is somehow in the upper left corner of my screen?
Okay, is this going to be final statement too? So I can get it all out right now?
You can get it all out.
Okay, I'll get it all out. There's a couple things at stake. Religious liberty is a foundation in this country, and it should be. But having Mandisa here is actually religious liberty that I want, because her stake is, I don't want to say more important, but her stake is so valuable, because if I don't have the ability to say no, then my yes is meaningless. If I don't have the ability to say no to religion and no to God and no to anything else, then my ability to say yes isn't really the ability. So I'm happy that Mandisa is a part of this. We don't have to agree on everything, but that shows that we have religious liberty, and that's what's at stake. What's at stake is your freedom of choice, your freedom of conscience, and we need to recognize that, and always think about that we have that freedom here, and know that other countries don't have that. And so recognizing that is very important. I would say, just a plug, if you've enjoyed this conversation, BJC has started a podcast called Respecting Religion, and it's actually called Respecting Religion because of the civil dialogue that goes on that podcast. So you can find that all over wherever you find your podcast. Again, that's Respecting Religion. The other thing that I say that is most important here is something that I said earlier, understanding that we are in a different time right now. And even though we're in a different time, we still can learn something. We hope that we go back to normal. We might have a new normal, But even during this different time, there is something that we can learn, and there's something that we can do to make sure that we are respecting the humanity of each person. To me, being religious is a part of my humanity. So if I respect my humanity and I respect your humanity, you're going to respect somebody else's religion. And that should be a part of everybody's life and how we should live. The last thing I would say is this. I am so thankful for our essential workers that are being promoted, as far as our doctors, our nurses, grocery store workers, and everything in there. I will throw this in there as a part of being a chaplain before in a children's hospital. The chaplain that are at these hospitals are not just helping the patients. The chaplains at these hospitals are helping the staff. These staffs are going through things. Many times the staff is coming to the chaplain to say, hey, we're going through it. Can you help? And it's not always the same religion. It's some people that don't have faith and some people do have faith. They look to see some guidance. And I would hope that all of us on this call will be a chaplain to each other and respect each other and be the best neighbor to each other that we can be. And that means stay at home for me.
Thank you for that. Mandisa, do you have some final remarks?
Yes, once again, appreciate Charles for the shout out, and I really appreciate what the direction of where this is going in the future. But quite frankly, the consequences of not adhering to the mandates is that more people will die. And as we are seeing this pandemic rapidly affect so many people, and particularly people of color who are at an economic, are at disadvantages as far as institutional wise and the access to healthcare, more people will die if we do not comply. And that is something that we don't want for any of our communities. So the more we work together to keep each other safe, to keep our families safe, as well as the people in the public that Charles mentioned who are still doing the work and who have to be out, because we have to acknowledge that. This will drag out longer if we do not do our parts in order to keep each other safe. And as someone whose organization, we host in-person events, right? We have larger conferences coming up at the end of the year. We certainly are monitoring the current circumstances, and we would have to make adjustments. But we're all doing what we have to do, and hopefully people will understand the importance that certain community organizers play, and that hopefully that support will continue for us even when we cannot host events in person. And again, it's not just about our individual needs, it is about the collective, and that's what we need to keep in mind.
Thank you, Mandisa. Richard, do you have any final remarks? I think you might be muted.
So yes, three quick points I want to make. So first, one concern I have, because I think almost across the political spectrum and religious spectrum, there's agreement that in these times, any thought of a religious exemption that would allow mass gatherings is out of the question. The question is, what are the implications going to be for how Americans, others think about the issues of religious accommodation and religious exemption in the future? And one concern I have is that, when that glorious day arrives, the doors are thrown open and we're able to once again gather and greet our friends and family, that the voices that already have regarded with suspicion the idea that there are times when religion needs to be treated especially, both in terms of not being allowed certain benefits, but also in terms of being allowed special accommodations, that it will be harder to make that case. That there'll be more reluctance that's sort of built up as an antibody, as it were, in the American physique. So that's one concern I have, is that we have to be, even as we all understand this is no time or place for religious accommodation or exemptions, that doesn't mean that there's never a time for religious accommodations and exemptions, that there's a special role that the religious conscience plays vis-a-vis when it comes to cross government rules and regulations that would either prevent somebody from adhering to their faith or require them to do things that are contrary to their faith. And so I hope we'll be able to get back at least to where we were when this all started, once it's done. Second is the issue of stigmatizing. And we just talked a moment ago about folks that are being the victims of attacks, either verbal or physical, in ways that blame communities for what's been happening. So we have to be really careful about that. Even the way we talk about communities which have had a disproportionate number of folks who have been scofflaws with respect to these rules and regulations. And I'm here thinking about, I hear people talking about all these Orthodox communities that are defying the rules about mass gatherings. There certainly are communities and individuals that are part of that larger community that have done that, but we also have to be aware that they're not part. That doesn't speak to the larger community either. So the issue of stigmatizing any community or any part of the community and tarring them all with a broad brush, we have to be really careful about that, even as we respond strongly. And I think we do need to respond strongly and vigorously, and with law enforcement, if that's necessary, to those individuals that are violating these rules for all of our good. And the final note I just want to make is, as we said a couple of times already today, Passover Seder, the first Seder takes place tomorrow evening. And, many of us feel that it's taking place under extremists. We're not with our families. We don't necessarily have all the things that we normally have to make a full celebration and Seder. And I think it's a time to be grateful that of all the times to be subject to these circumstances, we're living at a time when we're still able to be proud exponents, observers of our faith. And we live in a country where we're able to observe that faith. I've been reading about Seders that took place in hiding in the Inquisition. It was a bakery to make matzah that was under the Lodz ghetto during World War II, literally underground. A picture I saw today of several men baking matzah so there could be some modicum of observance of the holiday. And of course, there was a Seder in the displaced persons camps in 1945 and 1946, after the Jewish community had gone through, the human rights catastrophe. So, but basically what I'm saying is we have to take this in stride, and we also have to view it as a very serious matter, but also something that we have to view in perspective. That we have the resources, we have the friends, we have the communities that can lift each other up and enable us to get through this, and we will get through it. We'll come out on the other side, and things will be better once again.
Thank you for that. And Maggie, you get the last word.
Okay. So I sort of see three big things that I think are at stake. For mass gatherings, I mean, already been said, it's really a life or death issue here. It is a constitutional issue, but it's also a matter of life or death. And if we don't take these bans seriously, and if we don't all adhere to them, the pandemic is going to continue to spread. Another thing I see is what's at stake is precedent. So it's easy to say, well, this is just this one time, right? Like things are really crazy. We've never seen anything like this. And it'll just be this one time that you get the loan forgiveness, or the one time that we sort of smudge this rule. But it usually doesn't happen like that. Usually what happens is you make the excuse once, and then next time you say, well, we did it that way last time. An example of this, not to get into a whole nother church state issue, but is private school vouchers. We oppose private school vouchers, which I won't go into for church state reasons. But when there was Hurricane Katrina, they said, oh, this is unprecedented. We are going to give private school vouchers to religious schools in Louisiana, and it's sort of a one-time thing. It's Hurricane Katrina. We've never seen anything like Hurricane Katrina. We'll just do it this way. We know it's not written quite the right way, but we'll fix it next time, or we won't even do it next time. Next time you have Hurricane Sandy, and they say, oh, let's just take that language that we had in the Hurricane Katrina bill, because we were all totally fine with it then. Everyone voted for it. It was, Democrats, Republican, 100-0. We all voted for it. We'll just pick up that language and we'll put it over here in this Hurricane Sandy bill. And then there's floods in Texas, and they say, oh, There's floods in Texas. Let's look at that Hurricane Katrina bill and that Hurricane Sandy bill, and we'll just pick that up and put it in this one. And that is sort of the way that they make these rules, right? So it isn't always that it's a one-time fix. It sort of gets in there and it's hard to get out. And then third, something Charles mentioned is, you know, if you decide to take this money as a house of worship, what does that mean for you? If you want loan forgiveness, there are all sorts of requirements of paperwork and sending in your payroll and proving that they worked there and showing what they did. And once you get there, you know, do you want the government in there? So those are sort of the things I see.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for taking part in this webinar, and for everybody who is with us watching and asking their questions. There are a few that we didn't get to. I will make sure that they are directed to the panelists who most be able to respond to them. And again, I really appreciate all of our panelists' time and amazing insights into this subject. And thank you so much for being here.